rider appeared. He didn't push his horse fast, just kept it steady, letting the animal carry him closer to the cluster of storefronts. His coat was worn, the edges frayed from years of wind and rain, and his boots bore long scars from travel. The wide-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes, but even from a distance, people noticed the rifle tied down on his saddle and the revolver worn smooth at his hip. He felt the stares before he reached the general store. It was always the same. Every town wanted to know if a stranger was friend, drifter, or troublemaker. He lowered his eyes, not in shame but in habit, and guided his horse toward the outskirts where the farmland stretched. By the time he stopped in front of Galvin's ranch, his throat was dry and his chest felt heavy from the long ride. He dismounted, boots sinking into the dusty ground. He could hear chickens clucking from the pen and the creak of a windmill turning slow. The farmhouse door opened and Galvin stepped out. His shirt was patched at the elbows, trousers dirt-stained, hands scarred from years of fencing and plowing. He looked at the stranger in silence first, his eyes narrowing the way a man does when measuring risk against need. The stranger adjusted his grip on the reins, then finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of someone used to saying only what mattered. "I'm quiet, sir," he said. "I cook well enough. I'll keep the place clean." Galvin's brow furrowed. He studied the man's face, searching for anything that might give away a lie. The silence stretched. The stranger felt the tension in his chest tighten. He hated this part, the waiting, the judging. He didn't like begging for work, but money was thin and moving on without food or shelter would be worse. For a moment, fear slid under his calm surface. Fear that Galvin might see him the way most men did. A fighter, not a worker. A man with blood on his boots. He kept his hands still at his sides, forcing himself not to shift or fidget. Galvin finally gave a short nod. His voice carried no warmth but no suspicion either. "You're hired." The stranger let out the smallest breath, though his face stayed even. Relief touched him for a second, quickly followed by the familiar weight of responsibility. Work meant staying put. Staying put meant people might start asking questions. Inside, the house was dim, lit only by light slipping through the curtains. He hung his hat on a wooden peg by the door, wiped the dust from his brow, and set his few belongings neatly by the wall. He noticed Galvin's table was scratched from years of use, the dishes stacked but unwashed, the smell of yesterday's cooking still lingering. Without asking, he began to clear the table, rinsing plates in the basin with the kind of focus that made it clear he wasn't new to it. That evening he hauled water from the well, repaired a loose fence post and cooked a pot of stew. His hands moved with quiet precision, but his mind never relaxed. He thought about the eyes he felt in town, the whispers he knew would follow. He had learned to read the air. The place was tense, stretched thin, and men like him never went unnoticed for long. When the lantern burned low, Galvin leaned back in his chair and looked across the table. "Don't talk much, do you?" The stranger shook his head. "Not unless it's needed." Galvin studied him another moment, then said nothing more. Later, lying on a cot in the small back room, the stranger stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the boards. He knew he had bought himself a few days' peace, maybe more if he kept his head down. But deep inside, where the calm surface ended, he felt the sharp edge of stress, an old instinct telling him trouble wasn't far. He closed his eyes anyway, knowing he'd wake at the slightest sound. For now he had work, a roof and food. That was enough. The stranger tied his horse outside the general store and stepped down, brushing the dust from his coat. The sun was dropping, casting a red glow across the town. He carried only what he needed: flour, beans, a sack of salt, and a tin of coffee. When he stepped out onto the boardwalk again, the piano from the saloon drifted through the street. Laughter followed, rough and loud, mixed with the sharp sound of glasses being set down hard on tables. He should have gone straight back to the ranch. That was the smart choice. But his boots turned him toward the saloon doors anyway. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the need to read the kind of men who drank there, men who usually caused trouble first. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The room was hot and crowded, thick with cigar smoke. Men leaned over poker tables, voices rising and falling with every hand. A few cowhands shouted for more whiskey, while a ranch foreman argued about cattle prices at the bar. The stranger moved slow, not looking at anyone long, keeping his face still. And then she sang. Maribel Lane stood near the piano, one hand resting on the edge while the other lifted slightly as if to hold the rhythm. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the saloon, cutting clean through the noise. Smoky, steady, unshaken by the rowdy crowd. She wore a dark red dress, faded at the seams, and boots showed beneath the hem when she shifted her weight. Her eyes swept the room, watchful, sharp, not just performing but paying attention to who came and went. The stranger leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, staying in the shadows. He felt the edge of tension in his chest soften just a little. He wasn't a man for music, not anymore, but something in her voice slowed his breathing. He watched without meaning to, and when her eyes passed over him, they paused. Not long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for him to feel it. When the song ended, applause filled the room. She nodded once, stepping down. A man at the bar reached for her wrist, grinning with whiskey on his breath, but she slid past him without breaking stride. She walked toward the back, passing the stranger's spot by the wall. She stopped just enough to look at him. "You don't look like you drink much," she said, her tone low so it wouldn't carry. He shifted his weight, eyes steady on hers. "Not lately." "Then why sit in a place like this?" she asked, not smiling, just studying him the way he'd studied her. "Easier to watch the doors," he answered. Her eyes narrowed, but not in suspicion, more in thought. After a beat, she gave a small nod as if filing the answer away. "Keep watching then," she said, stepping past him and vanishing into the back hallway. The stranger stayed still, the words circling in his head. He didn't like being noticed, but he felt the corner of his mouth twitch, almost into a smile. Almost. A man 2 tables over leaned close to another and whispered, glancing at him. He caught the look. That old feeling returned, pressure building in the chest, the silent warning that trouble wasn't far behind. He pushed off the wall and walked out, the noise of the saloon fading behind him. Out on the street, the evening air was cooler, and the sound of her voice still carried in his ears. He shook it off, reminding himself of what mattered. Keep quiet, keep working, keep moving if need be. But when he rode back to Galvin's ranch that night, he realized something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just thinking about survival. He was thinking about her. The morning was already hot when the ranchers gathered at the dry well outside town. Dust clung to their boots, and the sound of restless horses echoed across the open ground. The well had been the only decent water source this side of the valley, but now it was nothing but cracked earth and rope hanging limp inside the stone rim. Men argued in low, bitter voices. "They got the river crossing," one said. "They charge double, and if you don't pay they take your cattle." Another spat into the dirt. "Jed Crow's got every rancher by the throat, and the sheriff just stands there polishing his badge." The stranger stood off to the side, leaning on the pump handle. He didn't join in, didn't need to. He already understood. Desperation made men reckless, and reckless men made mistakes that got folks killed. He kept his eyes steady on the road leading out of town, the one that cut toward the canyon where the gang usually rode. And right on cue they came. Jed Crow rode at the front, tall in the saddle, black vest catching the sunlight. His revolver gleamed, silver handle polished, like he wanted it noticed. The scar across his cheek pulled when he smiled, that wolfish grin that meant he enjoyed the fear he carried with him. Behind him, 4 men followed, their laughter sharp, too loud for the silence that had fallen. Crow pulled his horse up near the well, looking over the gathered ranchers like they were nothing but cattle at market. His voice was smooth, almost polite, but carried the threat of a knife at the throat. "Looks like you boys are thirsty," he said. "Shame about this well. Lucky for you I've got water flowing. Only costs a little extra now." Nobody spoke. The only sound was the creak of leather saddles as his men shifted, hands close to their guns. The stranger felt the familiar tightening in his stomach, the shift of his heartbeat into the steady rhythm of someone ready for violence. He told himself to stay still. This wasn't his fight, not yet. But his eyes locked on Crow and he didn't look away. Crow noticed. "You got a long stare for a man I don't know," Crow said, tilting his head. The men behind him chuckled. The stranger didn't answer. He bent down, lifted the empty barrel he'd brought, and swung it over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Then he turned and walked past Crow, boots crunching on gravel. That silence, the refusal to answer, was louder than words. Folks around the well shifted uneasily, sensing the weight in the air. Crow's grin faltered for just a second. He spat into the dust, his eyes narrowing. "Careful, friend," he called after him. "A man's stare can get him killed quicker than a bullet." The stranger kept walking, didn't even slow down. His jaw tightened, but he forced his body to remain calm, deliberate. Fear wasn't the problem. Fear he could manage. It was the heat under his skin, the pull to turn to settle this right there, that he had to fight back. He reached his horse, set the barrel down, and climbed into the saddle. He didn't look back at Crow, not once, because he knew men like him thrived on reaction. The less he gave, the more unsettled Crow would be. From the saloon porch, Maribel watched the whole thing. She stood with one hand resting on the doorframe, her eyes fixed not on Crow but on the stranger. She caught the way he moved, the control in it, the refusal to be baited. Her lips pressed tight together and she whispered something to herself that no one heard. As the stranger rode back toward Galvin's ranch, the noise of the town faded behind him. But in his mind the tension stayed sharp. He had tried to stay small, to blend in, but now Crow had seen him. And once a man like Crow saw you, he never forgot. The night was quiet except for the sound of boots scraping the saloon's back steps. The lamps inside had burned low, throwing weak yellow light against the alley. Barrels and crates cast long shadows. Most of the drunks had stumbled home, leaving the street empty. The stranger leaned against the hitching post, hat tilted low. He didn't plan to linger, but he had felt something pulling at him ever since the standoff at the well. He trusted his instincts, and they told him trouble was closer than folks wanted to believe. The back door creaked open. Maribel Lane stepped out, her dress catching a faint shimmer from the lamplight. She glanced around quick, checking the corners before letting the door shut softly behind her. Her boots clicked against the wood planks as she walked toward him. "You waitin' on somebody?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Just air," he said. She studied his face, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned in a little, lowering her voice. "They're planning to burn Galvin's barn tomorrow. Midnight." His eyes narrowed slightly but his body stayed still. "You sure?" "I heard it myself," she said. Her gaze shifted toward the dark street, then back to him. "Jed Crow was bragging to his men at the table. Said he'd smoke you out, see what you'd do." The stranger took a slow breath. He'd expected something, but hearing it spoken out loud brought the pressure into his chest all over again. He weighed his choices quickly: warn Galvin, prepare, or ride out tonight and leave it all behind. Leaving would keep him alive. Staying would mean a fight he hadn't come here for. Maribel stepped closer, her face half in shadow. "You could run. Nobody would blame you. But I don't think you're the running kind." Her words cut sharper than she knew. He kept his voice low, steady. "Why tell me?" "Because you don't scare like the rest of them," she said. There was no flattery in her tone, just fact. "And maybe because I don't want to see you killed before I know who you really are." Silence stretched between them. The air smelled of smoke from a lantern still burning inside. Her hand brushed his sleeve, not by accident this time. Just enough for him to feel the warmth of her skin. His first instinct was to step back, to keep the distance he'd lived with for years. But he didn't move. He let the contact stay, even as his thoughts warned him about the danger of letting anyone get too close. Maribel pulled her hand away before the moment could settle too deep. She glanced over her shoulder, then met his eyes once more. "Be ready," she said, voice soft but urgent. She turned and slipped back inside, the door shutting behind her. The stranger stood in the dark alley, staring at the empty space she'd left. His pulse hadn't slowed yet, and he hated how much her words stirred something he thought he'd buried: connection, trust, maybe even the start of something more. He shook it off, set his jaw, and stepped toward his horse. Tomorrow night, he knew, would not be quiet. The night settled heavy over Galvin's ranch. The air was still, too still, the kind of silence that pressed on a man's chest. The stranger sat at the table, lantern burning low, the stew untouched in his bowl. His ears were tuned to the wind, waiting for the shift that always came before trouble. Out by the barn, the horses shifted restless, snorting as if they could sense what was coming. Then the dogs barked. The stranger was already moving. He grabbed the rifle from its place by the door, pushed out into the yard, and scanned the dark edges of the property. A glow flickered at the far side of the barn, orange against the black sky. Within seconds, flames licked up the dry boards, crackling as the fire caught. "God Almighty!" Galvin shouted, running out of the house, pulling on his boots. "They lit it." The stranger's jaw tightened. He dropped to one knee, rifle steady against his shoulder. Shadows moved near the fence line, men darting in and out of the firelight. He fired once. A shout echoed, followed by the sound of boots pounding back into the dark. "Water!" Galvin yelled, hauling buckets from the well. His face was twisted with panic. "We'll lose it all." The stranger didn't answer. He kept his eyes locked on the tree line. Another figure broke cover, rushing forward with a torch in hand. He squeezed the trigger, another shot, another body hitting the dirt. His heartbeat slowed into that old familiar rhythm, the one drilled into him years ago. Breathe, aim, fire, move. The barn groaned as the roof timbers caught. Flames roared higher, lighting up the yard in a wild glow. The stranger moved toward the fire, firing into the dark whenever movement caught his eye. Galvin and his boy threw water uselessly at the blaze, their shouts drowned by the crackle and roar. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a flash of steel, one of Crow's men charging at him with a knife. The stranger dropped the rifle, drew his revolver smooth as breath, and fired at close range. The man fell forward, the knife clattering in the dirt. The stranger's hand stayed steady, though his stomach clenched. Killing again wasn't something he wanted, but survival gave no choice. By the time the gang broke and scattered, the barn was half gone, beams collapsing into a shower of sparks. The stranger stood in the smoke, chest heaving, revolver still warm in his hand. His shirt was damp with sweat, his face streaked with soot. "Damn them," Galvin muttered, his voice raw. He sank onto a barrel, hands shaking. "They'll come back." The stranger holstered his gun and picked up the rifle, eyes still scanning the horizon. He didn't answer. When the last of the flames burned low, a rider appeared at the edge of the yard. "Maribel." She dismounted quick, her skirt dragging in the dirt, her eyes wide as she ran up. "You're alive," she said, breathless. He looked at her, his face unreadable but his pulse still hammering from the fight. She touched his arm without thinking, gripping tight. He felt the tremor in her hand, fear, relief, maybe both. "You'll get yourself killed standing against them," she whispered. "Not tonight," he said, his voice low, steady, though inside the old fear was gnawing. Fear not of dying but of what this fight would pull him back into. Her hand stayed on his arm longer than it needed to. He didn't move away. For the first time in a long while, he let the contact stay, even as the fire behind them smoldered, sending sparks into the night sky. The rain came down hard that night, drumming steady on the roof of Galvin's house. The fire in the hearth hissed and popped as drops from soaked coats steamed off by the heat. The smell of wet wood and smoke filled the room. The stranger sat at the table, his revolver broken open, cleaning each round chamber with slow, precise movements. His face was pale under the lamplight, eyes fixed on the work as if staying busy kept the thoughts away. Galvin was upstairs trying to calm his son, who had woken crying after the attack. The old rancher's voice, low and strained, carried faintly down the hall. Maribel stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the rain sheet across the yard. Her dress was still damp, hair clinging to her neck. She hadn't said much since they dragged buckets of water at the barn. Now, with Galvin occupied, the silence between her and the stranger filled the room. Finally she spoke. "You could have died tonight." The stranger didn't look up. He slid the cylinder back into place with a soft click. "I've died plenty of times in men's eyes. Still here." Her gaze stayed on him. "You don't make it sound like that matters to you." He paused, fingers tightening around the grip of the gun. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he set the weapon aside, leaning back in the chair, exhaling slow. "Truth is, sometimes I wonder why I'm still here." The words hung heavy. Maribel turned from the window, walking closer, her shoes quiet against the wooden floor. She stopped just a few feet away, studying him in the warm glow of the lantern. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was something deeper there, pain buried so long it had turned into stone. "You've lost people," she said softly. He nodded once. His eyes flicked to hers, then away. "A woman. Years back. Took a bullet meant for me. Haven't forgiven myself since." Her chest tightened at the bluntness of it. She wanted to say something, but words didn't come easy. She stepped closer instead, lowering herself into the chair across from him. For a while they just sat there, the storm filling the silence. Finally she said, "You saved us tonight. Galvin, his boy, me. Don't say it means nothing." He looked at her then, really looked, at the earnestness in her eyes, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table as if she needed him to believe it. His jaw worked, but no words came. Instead he gave the faintest nod. Maribel leaned back, letting out a shaky breath. "You carry too much alone." He gave a half smile, though it held no humor. "That's the only way I know." The fire cracked. Outside, thunder rolled low across the plains. For the first time, the stranger allowed himself to rest his elbows on the table, leaning in slightly. The distance between them felt smaller now. Maribel's eyes softened. "If you're staying here, you'll have to let someone share the weight. Even if just a little." He didn't answer. But for once he didn't shut it down either. He just sat there watching her, the storm raging outside while something quieter, harder to name, stirred between them. The morning after the storm was gray and heavy. The ground outside the ranch house was soaked, wagon ruts filled with brown water, and the air smelled of wet earth. A mist clung low across the pasture, and the cattle moved slow, their backs slick with rain. Galvin stepped out onto the porch, his old shotgun resting against his arm. He scanned the yard like a man expecting trouble, every creak of the wet wood beneath his boots making him tense. The stranger was already awake. He stood near the barn, tightening the cinch on his horse, eyes on the tree line beyond the field. His posture was rigid, shoulders squared like he was waiting for something. It didn't take long. From the fog, 2 riders appeared, moving at an easy pace, their horses splashing through the puddles. They wore dark coats, wide hats low over their faces, guns resting visible on their hips. They didn't hurry. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. Galvin muttered under his breath, "Crow's men." Maribel came out behind him, pulling her shawl tight against the damp air. Her eyes flicked to the stranger, searching his face for a reaction, but his expression was locked down tight, unreadable. The 2 riders stopped just beyond the fence. One of them leaned forward in his saddle, grinning through broken teeth. "Morning, folks." Neither Galvin nor the stranger answered. The man's grin widened. "Jed Crow sends his regards." He reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. With a lazy motion he tossed it over the fence. It landed in the mud with a wet slap. Galvin's stomach turned as the cloth fell open. It was a bloodied rancher's hat. He recognized it. Belonged to his neighbor Amos Reed. The rider spat into the mud. "Crow says next week, every rancher pays. No exceptions. You don't, we'll burn this place down just like Reed's. Man had a family. Didn't stop us none." Galvin gripped his shotgun tighter, his face pale. Maribel gasped softly, her hand going to her mouth. The stranger stepped forward, calm, slow, every move deliberate. His voice was quiet but steady. "You tell Crow, if he comes here he'll find me waiting." The riders exchanged a look, then laughed, turning their horses. "We'll pass it along." With that, they rode back into the mist, leaving the yard silent except for the drip of rain off the roof. Galvin knelt and picked up the hat with trembling hands. His jaw shook with anger. Amos never hurt a soul. They killed him just to make a point. The stranger's eyes narrowed, following the riders until they vanished completely. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of violence he thought he'd left behind pressing back in. Maribel spoke, her voice low but firm. "You can't face them alone." He looked at her, then at Galvin. The farmer's shoulders slumped, grief written clear across his face. For the first time the stranger said it out loud. "I won't." The words carried finality. A decision had been made. The camera would linger on Maribel's eyes, the faintest trace of relief mixing with fear, before cutting to the fog-covered fields where Crow's shadow now hung heavy. Dawn broke in pale gray light, mist curling over the fields like smoke. The ranch was quiet, deceptively so, the calm before the storm. Galvin's hands shook as he loaded what ammunition he could muster. Maribel stood near the porch, holding a small bundle of supplies, eyes flicking between the barn, the distant tree line, and the stranger. The stranger had already saddled his horse, standing tall, revolver at his hip and rifle strapped across the saddle. His jaw was set, shoulders squared. He scanned the horizon, measuring every shadow, every movement in the fog. Crow and his men were coming, and he knew there would be no room for mistakes. A sudden shout echoed from the ridge. Dust rose from horses in the distance. Crow's gang, black shapes moving through the mist, silver revolvers glinting. The stranger moved first. He fired a warning shot, forcing the closest rider to duck. The clash erupted with deafening force. Smoke, gunfire, shouts. Galvin ducked behind a fence post, returning fire with shaky hands. Maribel clutched a shotgun, firing when she could, her heart racing. The stranger moved like a shadow through the chaos. His rifle was precise, deliberate. Each shot counted, each movement measured. One by one, Crow's men fell back or fled, their confidence shattered by his calm control. Crow himself emerged from the tree-line, silver-handled revolver raised, grin sharp and cruel. He fired. The stranger dove to the side, returning fire, both men circling in the mud and smoke of the battlefield. Finally, they faced each other in the center of the field, the rest of the gang gone. Crow's grin faltered as the stranger's calm, steady gaze locked on him. The wind carried the smell of wet earth, smoke and gunpowder. One breath. One heartbeat. Crow fired. The stranger fired. The silver revolver went down in the dirt. Crow stumbled, bleeding, and collapsed. Silence fell over the field, heavy and final. The stranger stood, chest heaving, eyes sweeping the horizon. He holstered his gun and looked toward the porch where Maribel and Galvin watched. Relief washed over them, tempered by exhaustion. Maribel ran forward, rain and sweat slick in her hair, and stopped just a few feet away. She looked at him, voice trembling. You did it." He gave a faint, tired nod. "It's done." Her hands reached for his, gripping tightly. He didn't step back. Instead, he let himself feel the connection he had avoided for so long. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to leave. Galvin approached slowly, placing a hand on the stranger's shoulder. "Reckon you saved more than just my ranch," he said, voice thick. The stranger shrugged, a small, private smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just did what needed to be done." Maribel stepped closer, resting her head slightly against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her gently, letting the weight of the fight, the fear, and the tension finally ease. Inside the house, the lanterns glowed warm. They sat together at the table, Galvin bringing water and food, the smell of coffee filling the room. Outside, the morning sun began to burn through the mist. The barn smoldered, but the ranch had survived. The stranger washed his hands, then set the towel aside. He looked at Maribel, her eyes meeting his, and finally let a real smile break free. "Guess I'm staying a while," he said. She smiled back, voice quiet but full of certainty. "Good. We could use you." The camera would linger on them, hands clasped across the table, lantern light flickering over their faces. The storm passed, the dust settled, and at last, a quiet that felt like home wrapped around the ranch. The story ends with the sun climbing higher, warming the fields, and the sense that finally these people were safe together and ready for whatever came next.